Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and in today's lesson, we're going to be in the 6th chapter in the book of Luke. We're going to begin in the 17th verse and try and make it all the way through. This is Luke's version of what Matthew calls the Sermon on the Mount, which is, in Matthew's case, the single longest recorded sermon in Scriptures. It spans the 5th through 7th chapter. But in Luke's chapter, one of the things we notice is that it takes place on a level ground. So in Luke's depiction of the event, it wasn't a Sermon on the Mount. And it also features elements of the 5th and the 7th chapter in Matthew's version. Not everything in them or in between them. And the snippets of the of Matthew's 6th chapter that we find are scattered throughout Luke's. For example, we read of the Lord's Prayer in the 11th chapter, which is prompted by a question from the disciples, and we also read of Matthew 6:24. No man can serve two masters. You must either submit to Mammon or Elohim. We read that in Luke 16:13. So Luke presents a lot of the same material in the context of questions and dialogues, and it is inconceivable to not imagine that the master may have said the same things more than once and in more than one occasion. For example, we read that in the first year of his ministry, he went to the temple in John's account and overturned the money lenders' chambers tables, and we read in the synoptics that this event took place in the 3rd year of his ministry, the 3rd and final year. So we have to understand that the Gospels are not every one of them or even all of them together are presented in a chronological sequence. Luke's takes place after the calling of the 12 apostles, and we read in the 5th chapter that he approached Levi, who is Matthew, of which we don't read until the 9th chapter in the book which bears Matthew's name. Yet Matthew, as an apostle, may have been privy to the sermon. He may have actually been there, whereas Luke, the evidence indicates that he was a post-resurrection convert, but he was a diligent historian, and we have no reason to disbelieve that even the second-hand accounts are not an accurate encapsulation of the things he did and the things he said. So that being said, we're going to open with the 17th verse. And coming down with them, he stood on a level place with a crowd of his disciples and a great number of people from all Judah and Jerusalem and from the coast countries of Zor and Zidon, who came to hear him and to be healed of their diseases. So the first thing we notice is that this was not on a mount, it was on a level, flat place, and the crowd consisted not only of Judah, of Jerusalem, but people from neighboring nations and coastal cities on the Mediterranean. So by this point, his fame had spread far and wide. He had established a reputation as a performer of miracles. He had provoked several controversies with the Pharisees for his, what they interpreted as sabbatical violations, but he had a reputation as a preacher, a teacher, and a healer, so many of them were there to be healed by them, others were there to hear the words which he spoke. And those who were troubled with unclean spirits, and they were healed. So just like that, we realize that the demon-possessed people, evil is another translation of the word unclean. They were healed because he has the magic hands and the magic touch. And all the crowd were seeking to touch him, for power went out from him, and healing them all. So all it took was, there was a misconception that all it took was a touch of his garments, but it is really an act of faith which accomplishes their healing. We witness in the 8th chapter in the book of Matthew that the Roman centurion says he is a man who is under orders, conditioned to issue commands and receive commands, and he recognizes the master's sovereign supremacy. He says all you need to do is speak the word and he will be healed, and such faith he found nowhere else in Israel, the master says. And he, lifting up his eyes towards his disciples, said, "Blessed are the poor, because yours is the kingdom of heaven." Now, the poor are a central theme in Luke's chapter. We often find special affection and concern in presentation of poor people, economically poor people, people who are poor in spirit, poor in money, and that's because Luke's emphasis was on the Son of Man, who his depiction of the Messiah was of the element of the Son of Man, who came to heal our infirmities and uplift us from our woes and ultimately translate our poverty into the unspeakable treasures of the kingdom of Elohim. Blessed are you who hunger now, because you shall be satisfied. Blessed are you who weep now, because you shall laugh. So the hunger he's speaking of is not the physical hunger, but the hunger and thirst after the righteousness and the kingdom. Although certain people were hungry, starvation was a fact of life for a lot of people in the ancient world, and a lot of them came to him because he could multiply loaves and fill their physical vacancy. But the hunger he's speaking of is the hunger after the word of God, the hunger after the things of God, the hunger after the work of God. And their tears will be turned, their frowns will be turned upside down, maybe not right away, but mourning will be a source of comfort, paradoxically, in the afterlife. Blessed are you when men shall hate you, and when they shall cut you off, and shall reproach you, and cast out your name as wicked, for the sake of the Son of Man. So we don't read everything that Matthew records in his Beatitudes, which spans the range of the 3rd through the 12th chapters in verses of the 5th chapter in the book which bears his name. But we see him addressing Matthew 5:3 in the 20th verse, and Matthew 5:6, and maybe one other in the 21st verse. Then he skips towards the 10th through 12th verses, in which he speaks of the blessings of persecution. Now, this is counterintuitive. The natural man, when he is pressured or pained or persecuted in any way, shape, or form, regards it as a cursing and an experience to be avoided. But the key is that if they are persecuted in the name of the Son of Man. So there is a difference between being an obnoxious and offensive person who calls themselves a Christian and being disliked and rejected and ridiculed because of it. But that doesn't count, because anything we do that's obnoxious or unseemly is not in the name of the Son of Man. Rejoice in that day and leap for joy, for look, your reward is great in the heavens, for that is how their fathers treated the prophets. So even though there's nothing to rejoice about in itself, it is a cause for joy and rejoicing, because so much so that they should leap for joy on the eternal reward which awaits them, and that is the same. Now, the Israelite nation had an abominable history of persecuting the prophets. It's a well-documented fact, affirmed by history and explained in Scripture, that he who exposes and denounces the evil is usually less well-liked, less popular than the evil they expose and denounce. So persecution comes with the job description of the prophet, as it does with the disciples. We are all persecuted in one form or another. The persecution we currently face as 21st century Christians in America is benign, but it will get worse before it gets better. We are nearing the door of the end times. But woe to you who are rich, because you are receiving your comfort. So there's actually a cursing now. The natural man tends to associate worldly wealth and riches and treasures with joy, because it gives them a shortcut. It provides many conveniences for them that they otherwise could not have in the absence of those items. But the afflicted of the comfort, and the comfort of the afflicted is one of the themes of the prophets, and the precedent is found in the book of Deuteronomy so far. So the Sermon of the Mount is paradox through and through, all the way down and all the way around and all the way through. Woe to you who have been filled, because you shall hunger. Woe to you who are laughing now, because you shall mourn and weep. So we witness a reversal of what he spoke of in the 21st verse. Blessed are you who hunger now. Now those who are filled, he's speaking of food in the physical sense. Those who have their appetites gratified and satisfied and fulfilled will one day enter, they will be hungry spiritually, because the things which feed the mouth cannot feed the spirit. And laughing now, they're not going to be left to laugh, but they will be mourning and weeping, those who treat life like a comedy and tend to trivialize the things that they should, by right, ought to take seriously. Woe to you when all men speak well of you, for thus their fathers did to the false prophets. So the presence of false prophets were every bit as prolific and perhaps even more numerous than the authentic prophets. We read of there was 450 prophets of Baal, when Elijah was convinced that he was the only one left in Israel who proclaimed the name of Yahweh, but he was assured that there were at least 7,000 others who did not bow down to the altars and shrines of Baal. But the false prophets were usually much more warmly received because they told the people what they wanted to hear rather than they wanted to know. And the unfortunate fact of life in any age or generation is that lies are a more lucrative commodity than truth. The truth goes a-begging while the lies fill the coffers, and there is much more profit margin in speaking a watered-down good news, which lessens the demands of discipleship, and that is one of our present dilemmas. And praise and reputation of men, the things which are treasured and esteemed in the eyes of man, are accounted as an abomination in the sight of Yahweh. Luke records the Savior as saying in the 16th chapter, 15th verse of this book. So we have to prioritize the good standing before the one who truly matters above those who do not. But I say to you who are hearing, love your enemies, do good to those hating you. So this is a revolutionary and radical principle to love the enemies. The natural man is inclined to hate their enemies who hate them and wish them harm, and to reciprocate the inclinations and orientations that they would inflict on them, on us. But the fire of hatred can only be quenched by the water of love. We are to overcome evil with good, we read of in Romans 12:21. And to do good to those who hate you, even though they mean us harm and do not mean us well, by extending them blessings, they may be less inclined to curse us and harm us, but even if they don't, it is still worth the effort, because we have nothing to gain and everything to lose by adding to the fire of hatred and contention. Bless those cursing you, and pray for those insulting you. So anyone who insults us is suffering from a sadness of spirit which requires our prayer and concern. Just because we are the targets of their insults and meanness and invective does not mean that they are unworthy of our prayers and blessings. And to him who hits you on one cheek, offer the other also. And from him who takes away your outer garment, do not withhold the inner garment either. So the principles of retaliation were embedded in the Mosaic law, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, etc., etc. And the reason that the principle for retaliation existed in Israel, but is absolved in the Christian church, is because Israel was national in charter, and as such, it was Yahweh's will that they resort to the necessary evils which are necessary to maintain the nation state. But as Christians, we have no national loyalties, collectively at least, so we are absolved from the necessary evils of nation states, which become for us unnecessary evils. So we are not bound by the same principles of retaliation, but are rather instructed to embrace it and find the blessing in the cursing of being struck on the cheek. And the same principle applies to those who take what belongs to us. We should give them more than what they asked for, should such a situation arise. And give to everyone who asks of you, and from him who takes away what is yours, do not ask it back. So the positive virtue of generosity is supplemented by the lack of greed, So whoever takes anything that belongs to us, we should not covet it. We should consider it theirs and no longer ours. And we should give without restraint, thought, or with abandon anyone who asks anything of us which is in our power to give. We should give it to them, whether it is time, money, advice, or just our very selves. And as you desire men should do to you, you also do to them in the same way. This is found in Matthew 7:12. This is known as the golden rule of Christianity, and every religion has their version of this rules, but what sets ours apart and makes us distinct and unique from all the others is others present the principle in a more negative portrayal, that being do not do unto others what you would not want done unto us, but it is far more difficult and challenging to extend the spirit of doing something positive in the directions of others than it is to refrain from inflicting harm on them. And if you love those loving you, what grace have you? For sinners too love those loving them. So sinners, the confederacy of sinners, the gangs, they have a certain level of loyalty between themselves, if even though they are treacherously motivated to others around them, they are at least united in themselves in their treachery. And so if the if love has to spread anywhere first, why not with you? Why not be the one to extend the spirit of the love? Because if you respond to hate with more of the hate, all you do is add to the fire of the hatred which is there, and not necessarily or rightly so. And if you lend to whom you expect to receive back, what favor have you? For even sinners lend to sinners to receive as much back. So the practice of money lending or putting any item at all into the debt of another, that should not be extended only to those who have the power, the ability, and the inclination to return the reward you have given them, but should also extend to sinners who might abuse our generosity. Rather love your enemies, and do good, and lend, expecting not in return, and your reward shall be great, and you shall be sons of the Most High, because he is kind to the thankless and the wicked ones. So there's a lot in this verse. Once more, the principle of loving one's enemies is embedded, doing good, and forfeiting any immediate return or response from humans, because we run the risk of sacrificing our eternal reward in heaven, and when we do these things as we are instructed, we shall be called, we shall be adopted into the heavenly homeland, and he is kind to the thankless and the wicked ones alike, as we read of in Matthew 5:45. He makes the sun to shine and the rain to pour on the just and the unjust alike. The difference is that the just one is grateful to the giver, whereas the unjust one will be at best grateful for the gifts, but not acknowledge the source from whence they came. Therefore be compassionate, as your Father also is compassionate. The Messiah was certainly compassionate. We read of many miracles, particularly in the books of Luke and Mark, which were motivated by a compassion. So he saw a need in people who had something that they needed that he could provide, and his compassion compelled him to extend them what they wanted or needed. So compassion is a virtue which is closely connected to merciful, and mercy is a trait of divinity which, like every other trait and attribute of divinity, we are to endeavor to cultivate in as much as it lies with respect to our human limitations and regard for our potential. So we're actually going to cut it short, because this concludes the Luke 6th chapter of what is encapsulated in Matthew's 5th. We'll take it upon ourselves to do a lesson after this, which is the 36th through 47th verse, which is his commentary of which we read in Matthew's 7th chapter of the Sermon of the Mount. That's all the time we have for today. I'm glad you're here. Keep coming. Stay tuned till next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.